Welcome to Tomorrow's Cities podcast, a series of conversations on urbanization and disaster risk reduction created by the Tomorrow Cities Hub, a 5-year interdisciplinary research project working internationally to foster a transition from crisis management to multi-hazard risk-informed urban planning in cities of the Global South. My name is Sérgio Francinha and I'm the Hub's Communications Officer. In this episode, we talk to Dr. Gemma Cremen from University College London and Professor Jeremy Phillips from the University of Bristol on how community knowledge paired with state-of-the-art physics-based computational modelling is helping to shape more inclusive natural hazard risk reduction policies.
Hi everyone and welcome to the third episode of Tomorrow Cities podcast. Today we're Dr. Gemma Cremen and Professor Jeremy Phillips. Thank you both, Gemma and Jared, for joining us. Gemma is a civil engineer. She earned her degree from University College Cork in Ireland, followed by a master's and a PhD at Stanford University, where she delved deeper into earthquake engineering. Today, Gemma serves as a lecturer in risk and resilience engineering at University College London, where her research focuses on developing innovative tools for disaster risk management, empowering decision makers to create safer societies for tomorrow. Jeremy is Professor of Volcanology and Natural Hazards at the School of Earth Sciences in the University of Bristol. He's an expert in environmental hazard and risk resilience, specializing in physical volcanology. With a background in fluid dynamics and volcanic processes, Jeremy's research focuses on predicting volcanic hazards such as ash transport and landslides. And currently his research explores the cascading impacts, including volcanic ash's effects on agriculture and infrastructure, as well as hydrometeorological hazards like lahars, volcanic muds or debris flows, and sediment charge floods. His work involves collaboration with academic, artistic, and governmental agencies to improve hazard prediction and risk management. Well, both of my guests' work extends beyond merely gathering and generating data. It involves harnessing multidisciplinary knowledge to safeguard communities and bolster resilience on a global scale, and that's what we'll be talking about today. They're both working in work package 3 of Tomorrow Cities, is computational modeling section of our Tomorrow Cities decision support environment. Thank you, Gemma and Jerry. Well, I'll start with Gemma. Let's start from the beginning. Gemma, what exactly is earthquake risk modeling? What kind of methods, technologies do you use, and how has this field evolved in the recent past? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So earthquake risk modeling really involves understanding the uncertain negative effects of earthquakes on the built environment. So what it brings together is really the fields of seismology, which tells us information on the uncertain strength of shaking associated with earthquakes, and earthquake engineering, which translates those strength estimates into damage to the built environment using engineering models and techniques. And then knowledge of finance can be used to express these damage estimates in terms of financial losses, for instance, though other types of loss metrics are becoming more prevalent. And the whole sort of process is tied together with tools from probability and statistics that allow us to express different components of the calculations, accounting for uncertainty. And I would say that, in recent times, we are really seeing a push to start thinking beyond expressing the results of these calculations in terms of financial losses, which would be traditionally of interest to the insurance industry, for instance. We're now looking at other types of losses that capture the effects of earthquakes on people's everyday lives in terms of, well-being, loss of access to important facilities, etc. And that type of modeling is really requiring risk modelers to reach out and interact beyond their traditional discipline boundaries with, for example, social scientists and economists. And then, of course, like many other fields, I think earthquake risk modeling is taking advantage of artificial intelligence and machine learning, for instance, one way in which we see that is through using these tools to predict shaking associated with actual ongoing earthquakes for earthquake early warning applications, for instance.
It seems like it is right at the cutting edge of technology at the moment, and you are really harnessing the potential of new methods to reduce risk when it comes to earthquakes. Jerry, your research looks into forecasting hazards such as hash transport, muds, debris flow, landslides, all that more associated with volcanoes or volcanic eruptions. Can you explain exactly what that means? I mean, what are these ash transports? How are they connected to volcanoes? And what kind of methods do you use to try and forecast these hazards? And maybe, well, give us an example of where these are very prevalent, I suppose.
Okay, well, there's quite a lot to unpack there, but
It is.
I guess, you know, where we start in our thinking about volcanoes is that they're a classic multi-hazard environment. So volcanoes produce a wide range of different impacts. Often those impacts are connected together, and people live in close proximity to volcanoes for a variety of different reasons. So, you know, so the real world is more complex than the child's storybook idea that people live near volcanoes because the soil is very fertile. They're often there as a result of a complex set of social circumstances. Volcanoes can erupt explosively, and what that means is that there's an explosion that releases fragmented volcanic rock, so ash, into the atmosphere. That can be dispersed by the wind, but that can also be deposited very close to the volcano. It can be remobilized by rainfall into a type of mud flow, which we call a lahar. And so there are many different potential impacts to try and assess and try and quantify if we want to understand risk around volcanoes, noting as well that risk is socially generated. And so part of the issue there is understanding the context and the circumstances of people who live there as well. So the first step in that is to try and assess and quantify the hazard. So the way we would do that is by a combination of understanding historical events, historical activity. How often has the volcano erupted in the past? What's the extent of the impacts associated with that? And often we then try and augment that record by using simulations, using computer modeling. And the type of work I do is to create models that reproduce the physics of these processes so we can make predictions that include information about the extent of the impacts, but the physical mechanism of those impacts and also the timing of those impacts. So these type of models help us inform things like early warning systems. Modeling can generate any range of outputs depending on any range of inputs. So what's critical in this process is that we often rely on local knowledge of people who are impacted by hazards to provide information about the ground truth, and also for us to understand what are the key locations, what are the important areas in terms of the consequences of those impacts. So hopefully that's given you a bit of a flavour of how we try and do this type of forecasting.
Yeah, absolutely. It really does. I was just looking at, you were just mentioning how you harness some of this community knowledge. It's all of the work that you do is to try and protect people and infrastructure and societies in general. And I was thinking that one of the things that I read that you focus on is on the exploring the cascading hazard impacts of specifically volcanic ash and how it impacts on agriculture, urban infrastructure. Can you give us? I mean, I think we can all think about our big cloud of ash might impact society, but maybe there's some hidden things that we probably, as someone that doesn't work on the area, doesn't understand. Could you kind of go a bit deeper into that specific issue of how ash might impact societies?
So I can give you a couple of examples with a bit of kind of geographical context as well. So the first situation to think about, given that we're based in the UK, is where the volcanoes are around the UK. And there's a lot of focus on Icelandic volcanism. So there's currently new volcanic activity in the in the western part of Iceland, which is concerning us in the UK. So ash, the impacts of ash are directly related to how close you are to the volcano. So, for example, if there's a significant explosive eruption in Iceland, then within 50 to 100 kilometers of the volcano, you will end up with potentially up to meters of ash deposited. And what that means is it causes significant physical damage to infrastructure. So essentially, it can cause roof collapse in buildings. It can cause all sorts of damage to more sensitive or critical infrastructure, as well as being extremely disruptive and requiring a lot of work to clear that away. In the UK, where we are, we can be affected by ash from Icelandic eruptions, even though we're more than 1,000 kilometers from Iceland. And here, the scale of the impact is very different. So we would expect from a large Icelandic eruption to maybe get millimeters maximum of ash deposited on the UK. But that can still have significant consequences. So, for example, that amount of ash would significantly affect transportation. It would make roads extremely slippery. It's very difficult to get workforce around. We're very strongly dependent on complex supply chains in the UK. So even a small amount of disruption to transport could be significant in terms of how it affects us for the period immediately after an eruption. That ash also can, even trace amounts of ash can get into watercourses, can significantly affect water supplies where you have open watercourses. But also even very small amounts of ash can affect sensitive critical infrastructure, which and we have examples of that in the UK. So there's a strong dependence on the type of impact you have depending on how far away you are from the volcano. There's also a time dependence on those impacts as well. What I've talked about are the immediate things that happen very shortly after the eruption, but where you have large amounts of ash deposited, that gets remobilized by rainfall. And often rainfall is seasonal, which means that in some areas where volcanoes are persistently active, they're always depositing a little bit of ash. It doesn't affect you very much on a day-to-day basis, but then if you have all of that remobilized in a relatively short rainy season, you can have significant impacts. I haven't said very much about agriculture, but perhaps to give you another quick example of those type of impacts, then I can take you to a volcano called Tungurahua in Ecuador. Here, ash is deposited very close to the volcano. It's in the Andes. It's a very high volcano. So essentially, there are complex wind patterns around the volcano that deposit the ash very close to the volcano. The impacts of that ash damages the plants. It doesn't really change the soil very much, but it physically damages the plants. And people who farm in that area have learned to recognize slightly different ash compositions by their color. And that means they can anticipate the different type of impacts there are, and they change the type of crops that they plant in order to respond to the recent activity of the volcano. All of that material is also remobilized as lahars and ultimately ends up causing problems to water supply for agriculture further down the valleys where that water is often extracted and used in that way. So hopefully you get the sense that these can be quite complex and interconnected processes.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I was thinking while you were talking about how the importance of having data and information so that you can build solid risk models to, well, not to predict, but to forecast, and not just necessarily just to forecast the event itself, but the cascading impacts, and to be able to adapt your infrastructure and your supply chains and even your agriculture, as you were saying, that they adapt their own crops to the eruption, so that you can create enough information so that you can create processes to adapt your societies and the infrastructure and the processes to that situation. And on that sense, Gemma, I think we can maybe in that notion of forecasting, but also prepare societies for an incoming hazard. We recently had a very devastating earthquake in southeastern Turkey in Syria that was just over a year ago. And obviously, without delving too much into sensitive policy matters, how could earthquake risk modeling have been instrumental in guiding urban development, or even, well, in retrofitting infrastructure to improve seismic resilience and maybe reduce this devastating impact that the earthquake had?
Yeah, so earthquake risk modeling, it's traditionally applied in the current sense. So we're looking at current buildings, current infrastructure, the current urban form. But we can also apply it in a very forward-looking way, and that requires hypothesizing on where future infrastructure would be located, and what kind of how that infrastructure would be built. And then what we can do is we can do a series of sort of like what if risk models. So what if we had this type of locations or urban form, urban development pattern, and what would happen if this type of material was used to construct our infrastructure and our structures, and then how much loss might we obtain from future earthquakes in that case. And the types of ways in which we measure loss can be in various ways. As I mentioned before, traditionally we would have done this in terms of a financial measurement. And then we can change around the locations of the future infrastructure, but also the way in which they're built. And we can determine which sort of configuration, which sort of setup leads us to the lowest amount of loss, whatever that loss of interest is. Another thing that we can think about in that case is we can balance that against cost, because of course cost also comes into these considerations. So if it's necessary, we can think about how we balance the loss associated with different configurations with the cost associated with actually implementing that type of configuration. And then it's also important to mention, I think, that we can only go so far with the way in which we build our infrastructure and our buildings. It's not the case that we can get to a situation where the probability of damage occurring in any future earthquake is zero. It's just not feasible. So we can also test, other types of mitigation strategies or policies that we could use in addition or as an alternative to hard engineering approaches that actually change the materials of our buildings. So, we could think about, well, okay, if there is this amount of loss, what would happen if we supplement, people's income with additional money that would allow them to repair their buildings after earthquakes. In that case, kind of assuming or accepting the fact that some damage will occur to the infrastructure, So we can balance different strategies in terms of the losses that they might incur with the cost associated with implementing those policies in the first place. And if we implement that in a forward-looking way, we can actually plan out a future where there is a level of loss that we have understood and that we have tried to minimize as much as possible.
Thanks, Gemma. I think that's a very interesting insight. And on that sense, I think we can try and delve a bit into these, because you were just mentioning how not everything is focused or might be focused on infrastructure, on retrofitting or making or building better infrastructure or making it safer. There's also some soft policies that can be used to reduce the recovery interval of families in a disaster situation. So would you, for both of you, would you be able to think what are the most pressing challenges or gaps in the current understanding and mitigation strategies? Where do you see opportunities for future research, collaboration, but also for policy? How do you think that maybe the disaster risk reduction field where should it go somehow?
Yeah. Jerry, do you want to go first, or?
So I guess I'm going to present. I guess in the project, we've spent 5 years learning to get us to the point that Gemma really clearly just articulated around the recognition that risk is not just loss, and that impacts are not just infrastructure. Okay, and so I think there are some things that are now emerging from the work we've done, for which will set the future research agenda. And so one of those, for example, is how do you incorporate informal settlements into thinking about how future urban plan works. So what I mean by that, just to be clear, is places where people live that are not covered by current urban plans. In some global cities, that can be a significant proportion of the people who live in the city. So thinking about how are those people represented in any planning and decision-making processes in the future around how to reduce risk, I think is really important. But it's challenging because of the lack of their involvement in the formal planning process. I think other things that we're learning about are thinking about the challenges of how to incorporate how people respond to hazard events into this. So, necessarily the work of our project is about trying to characterize the whole city system, but actually a significant part of that is what do people do as a result of a hazard event occurring, and how can we anticipate that in planning how to minimize disruption or how to reduce some of these non-infrastructure impacts of the hazard events. And finally, and what wraps around everything we've been talking about, is how do we think about uncertainty in all of this? What does uncertainty even mean in a process of planning to mitigate for hazard events, or even what does uncertainty mean for people who are living with those hazard events? So I think that those are 3 aspects that I think have emerged from the work that we've done in the project to date, which I think will be important as part of the future research agenda.
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo them very strongly. I think particularly, the one on this ability to understand how people actually respond to different strategies is really important. So, I outlined a policy that's very straightforward to reflect in a risk model, which is a retrofitting policy. Okay, we have to make some assumptions on how that retrofitting policy translates into reduced damage to the built environment, but there's a very clear way of integrating that into the calculations. But when it comes to some other types of policies that, you know, we're told are effective seismic risk reduction measures, like better education on how to respond to future hazards, it's really not clear yet how we can reflect that in a risk model and how that might eventually lead to reduced losses. So there needs to be a lot more research into how that actually plays out in reality. And I think that requires very close integration of social science and physical science and risk modeling research. And another point that I would touch on as well is, you know, at the very start of a risk model, we need a handover of information from hazard modelers to engineers or to risk modelers. And I think there is a lot of information that hazard modelers have about hazards that we haven't yet taken advantage of in our engineering models, because there has been, you know, a communication, not a breakdown, but there's challenges there where the hazard modelers are asking, well, what type of hazard measurements do you want? And, you know, we're kind of asking, well, what types of hazard measurements can you give us? And we haven't yet kind of really solved that in terms of closing the loop completely. So there's many aspects where we have challenges and opportunities for the future, I think.
Gemma, you've just mentioned something which is beyond technology and beyond science. Well, this issue of the handing out or exchange of information between hazard models and engineers. It's not really a technical issue. It's probably more of a communication issue. And going into that, have you observed changes in terms of public awareness, the integration of research findings into policymaking processes? How do you see that has developed in the last, 10 to 15 years? Do you think that's our policymakers more aware? Is the public more aware of the issue? And are on the other hand, are scientists, researchers more able to communicate the findings and to influence policy in a more effective way?
Yeah, I mean, I believe so. I think so. You know, even if you take like the narrow, let's say, focus of earthquake risk models, you know, in the past 10 to 15 years to maybe 20 years, there has really been a push to make the outputs of earthquake risk calculations more interpretable to stakeholders, with the explicit aim of facilitating decision making in various contexts. So, for example, in earthquake engineering, one of the biggest innovations that we've had in the last 20 years has been performance-based earthquake engineering, where we're orienting the design of our buildings not in simple sort of life safety terms that we would have used traditionally and are traditionally embedded in building codes, but we're actually orienting those designs in terms of metrics like how much repair cost will this cause in a specific earthquake? How much casualties will it cause? How much downtime will it cause? And so by making our calculations oriented in a way that is more digestible and more real life to the public and to stakeholders, we're really able to make them more aware and make them make more informed decisions about risk and future risk in general, I think.
Jerry, would you like to add some things on your specific?
Well, so I guess I can give you an example. So I've talked earlier about remobilizing volcanic ash into mud flows called lahars, and I guess a couple of examples of how things have moved on in that field, understanding their impacts over the last 10 to 15 years. So I think one is very much technical and technological advances. So 15 years ago, then the best we could do with a predictive model was to give an indication of how material would spread out in this type of flow, so how much area would be impacted. Now, because of the increases in computer power, then we're able to solve dynamic models, so physics-based models that, as well as computing the area that's impacted, also provide information that enables us to calculate what those impacts might be, the mechanisms by which those flows cause damage, but also how long the material takes to spread out. So in simple terms, we can now start to do better with early warnings, and this comes, in the current climate of the UN's drive for early warnings for all. So simple increases in technological capability can move what we can predict into much more useful territory for people. And I think that alongside that, the research frameworks that accompany that have started to become very much more interdisciplinary in nature, and in particular focusing on how to harness interdisciplinarity towards co-development with those affected of outcomes and research understanding. So I think what you've seen is a kind of corresponding broadening of the way we might view risk, because we have new tools, and that gives us new ways of thinking about that.
I think that's a very good moment to introduce specifically what Tomorrow Cities does, because that's exactly right on that space that you both just mentioned. I think, well, we are focused on envisioning the future, equipping urban planners with the tools to create a more inclusive disaster resilient cities. And both of you have contributed significantly to this through your work in the hub. What impact do you believe that we are having, or we will have, in the cities because of these efforts?
I think the biggest effect we've currently had on cities is education on risk in general. So, we've showcased how when you make different decisions about the way in which your city will look in the future, in terms of the layout, in terms of the types of policies that you implement, the effects of future hazard events can be totally different. And by implementing various changes, you can reduce those effects significantly. And so really making people understand that they have the power to alter their own future and their own, the negative consequences associated with the future by making good informed decisions today on what their future city will look like. So I think that's the biggest achievement we've made so far, has really been an awareness raising among many different stakeholders in the cities in which we have gone into. So that would definitely be the first step on a way to eventually, helping cities to actually make and implement the decisions that we're sort of showcasing at the moment through our various workshops and stakeholder outreach initiatives.
So I can follow that with a specific example of this in the context of Quito City, where I've been working for a few years now as part of the project. And I think that one of the ways we see the consequences of that education in Quito has been to bring together the risk management and planning divisions of the municipal government of the city, and really having a strong integration between the operation of those two areas. Both of those areas are critical for risk reduction, but typically in large urban settings, then there's granularity and division of activity into different departments, which is not always helpful when we are trying to tackle something that's pervasive as natural hazard risk. And so I think, through education in Quito, we've been able to bring those parts of the municipality into much closer collaboration. And the consequence of that is that it then provides a mechanism by which we can bring the communities that are affected into dialogue with those decision makers. So I think that's just perhaps a couple of examples specifically from Quito where the consequences of that education process have resulted in practical changes for the operation of the municipality and how communities can engage with that directly. One of the things that we're also doing by necessity in this project is that we are having to drive an agenda about how to rapidly use the sort of modelling tools that we have in terms of both understanding the hazard and the impacts. We're having to drive the use of those tools onto significantly shorter timescales than perhaps they've been used in the past. So one of the things that's really important to the ability to use the tools of the hub to support decision making is that these type of activities can't take many years to achieve, because that becomes comparable with the timescales over which city governments turn over and personnel turn over. So there's a need to move these activities onto a shorter timescale and to take a more comprehensive view about how these predictions are used in decision making more generally. So I think that's an interesting emerging area from the work that we're doing. How do you achieve this process on a timescale that's tractable to affect change?
I had a question here, but I think I'm going to skip it because in a way you've already addressed this. And I also invite everyone who's listening to read one of the articles that we have on our website specific on impact modeling, on the work that Gemma's team is doing. So, but I think I'd like to talk a bit more about this last issue that Jerry has mentioned, which is on the relation between communication of risk and communication of uncertainty to policymakers, which is something that I feel, coming from a country where we are exposed to earthquakes. We had a massive earthquake in the 18th century. And I feel that although we had an historical earthquake, we had another one in 69, which was very, very impactful as well, we still do not have a culture of risk in the country. It seems like most people are not aware of uncertainty, of what risk means. And maybe that's because it's not prevalent, it's not present on a daily basis, like it is, for example, in Japan or in other countries where that happens very often and things that people are aware. And I think that's a problem. I feel that in countries where these things are not as frequent as they are in others, you tend to relax. You tend not to be as aware of the risk that's luring behind you. How do you deal with this? How do you create societies? How do you influence policymakers to have this issue present in a more prevalent way? What would be your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I have many thoughts on this. Thanks for raising it, Sergio, because I think it's super, super important. I think the first thing is to start with the concept of risk. What is risk? So I think through the Tomorrow Cities project, we've turned the concept of risk on its head in a way. So up to now, risk is kind of measured in financial losses. But what we've said in Tomorrow Cities is risk is really whatever it means to you. What is the effects of these hazards on your life? And so we've what we say is we've democratized the concept of risk. And I think one of the issues with communicating risk is that it tends to be communicated in terms of some sort of monetary loss, like, 8 billion dollars or pounds or whatever. I don't even know how many zeros there are in 8 billion. Never mind like people who aren't involved in our field. So how do you even interpret that? And it's really unrelatable to your life. But if you can talk about risk in terms of, how many people will lose access to education for how long might you be unemployed? Is there a possibility that you will actually need to leave your hometown? These types of measurements of risk, I think, are much more effective and will help to foster kind of a more open conversation about risk in the future. The second thing I would say is that uncertainty is a really difficult and challenging issue for risk modelers to deal with when communicating to the general public. My own kind of sense is that there needs to be a balance. In some places, you can introduce the concept of uncertainty, and in other places, it just confuses the issue. So for me, I think the way in which I would incorporate it into an earthquake risk modeling approach is to forget about uncertainty when it comes to the earthquake itself, okay? We're just going to assume that this earthquake occurs and, with all the caveats that it will not occur, but something similar might occur. But to sort of introduce the idea that many different earthquakes can occur with many different magnitudes, that just confuses the situation in my mind. So we start off with a let's say what we would call a deterministic earthquake scenario, where we know exactly how much shaking that causes in different areas. And then what we can do is we can talk about the losses, the impacts of that earthquake, and gently introduce the concept of uncertainty at that point. So saying, these are the losses that we expect, but they might be as high as X or they might be as low as Y. So that's kind of the way in which I think we best introduce uncertainty into the public communication sphere at this point.
Well, so I think I can pick up on maybe a couple of aspects of what you've just been talking about. So I think what you said, Sergio, that's super important is that there can be a wide range in different global cities. There can be a wide range of different frequencies over which hazard events occur. Okay, and so how can we think about communicating risk when that type of risk is not present in people's daily lives? That's a huge challenge if you're talking about an 18th century earthquake or whatever. So I think that going back to something that Gemma said earlier, education is critical. And so foundational to even having the concept of risk from a natural hazard event is having an understanding or a perception of historical events and what those consequences have been. And so I think if we're going to talk about communicating risk, we need to think about educating around risk as well. And the other critical component there, and this is perhaps something that we need to expand our thinking about in the future, is that as well as democratizing the ideas around risk, we need to recognize that risk from natural hazards is but one threat that people face on a day-to-day basis. So it's all about contextualizing what this means. Yes, it can be big and potentially catastrophic in the future, but how people can engage with something depends very much on what affects their day-to-day. So, in order to improve our communication around natural hazard risk, we have to have processes that bring into dialogue with that other daily threats that people face. And that is in some way implicit in the theme of tomorrow's cities. So it's reducing disaster risk, particularly for the urban marginalized or the urban poor. But it's about understanding what being marginalized and what being poor means on a day-to-day basis. So I think that's super important. Connected to that, perhaps, is that, when we talk about uncertainty, I'm a physical scientist, Gemma is an earthquake engineer, then, we have a quantitative understanding of what uncertainty is. Gemma just illustrated that. Is that what's the range of impacts in some kind of quantitative sense? People live with uncertainty around natural hazards on a day-to-day basis, and what that means to them is something completely different. And so I think if we're communicating uncertainty, the most important thing is the two important things are to be really clear about what we mean by uncertainty, but also to be really clear that we acknowledge that that doesn't necessarily mean the same thing to everybody. And so, that's, I think, where we need to move to in the future to increase the effectiveness around how we're communicating those concepts.
It's about context, isn't it? It's about the individual context that people are living in, rather than how we or you as researchers see it in a lab. It means two very different things for what a number means in terms of infrastructure. How do you build the infrastructure? How you plan a city? How you write the policies? And what is the real life of an individual on the ground living with that uncertainty? And in his life, there's more uncertainty than uncertainty related to hazards.
Absolutely.
Right. And so it's kind of difficult to add another layer of uncertainty to someone who's probably worried about income uncertainty, job uncertainty, health uncertainty. So it's a very tricky issue, I would say.
The way we're trying to connect to that in tomorrow's cities is by having the future urban visioning being the product of many people's perspectives. Yeah. And so yes, this is very difficult territory to navigate. As you said, there's lots of complexities that face people on a day-to-day basis. But having those people in discussions around their future urban setting is one way of starting to bring some of that background into the conversation. And that's I think a significant advance beyond the idea of doing scientific and engineering risk-based calculations. Absolutely. And making predictions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's probably what I see as one of the biggest strengths of Tomorrow Cities, is the fact that the project is actually giving voice to those who overall we hear this and we read this in UN's reports, etc., that the urban marginalized are always the most impacted populations when disasters occur. What I find interesting in Tomorrow Cities is that looking into that specific aspect, the project is able to address it, saying, well, if they are the most impacted, then what do they have to say about that fact? And how we can help them is to ask them directly what are their priorities, how are their visions, their needs, the things that we might be overlooking if we didn't ask them directly. So I think that's very crucial, and I think that's a big difference. And it really is a privilege to see this multidisciplinary work between physical scientists, engineers, geographers, social scientists, and I think that's a big advancement that the project has brought to the field. I'm not sure if you want to add anything. We've been talking for quite a while. It's been very interesting conversation with a lot of insights into your work, into the future, to the current state of affairs, but also projecting into the future. Do you want to add anything else?
I think I've given you all my good stuff already. So, no, I mean, I think we've captured it pretty nicely, and I think the conversation has been a nice balance of what comes from our disciplines and our background, but how it's been integrated in the project. So I don't think there's nothing particular that I think we've missed from my perspective in the discussion.
Yeah, I would say the same. I think I would just emphasize, that this is an ongoing set of challenges that we're trying to address, and it's not something that's going to be totally complete by the end of the project. But yeah, I think we've identified challenges, but also opportunities through this, and our mission continues even after the project ends.
I think that's a very good point, and I think it's a good point that we need to make over and over again, not just in disaster risk reduction, but in science in general, is that we do not provide a final answer to problems, because problems evolve, societies evolve, new problems arise with the evolution of society. So it's an ongoing work. And I think sometimes we need, that's a type of uncertainty that I believe that we need to communicate more, the uncertainty of science in general, and the fact that we do not provide a final answer to things, and that things are evolving, and we evolve with it as well. We keep evolving and providing new answers and trying to address new problems. Well, I think I just need to thank you both for joining this episode of our podcast. I invite everyone to go onto our website. There's a very great collection of articles that go deeper into the several aspects of the Tomorrow Cities project, the decision support environment, which is our framework for inclusive disaster risk reduction. And yeah, that's it. We'll have a few other episodes soon enough, so stay tuned. And thank you very much to Jerry and Gemma for joining us in this episode. Thank you. Take care.
For more information on the project, visit tomorrowcities.org and follow us on X, LinkedIn, and YouTube.